If you're interested in the Mafia, there's probably some other organized crime group that's caught your attention. For me, it's Silk Road, and to a lesser extent the darknet markets that followed its example. I'd heard news stories of this Amazon of drugs, created by someone who'd figured out how to use Tor to run an online black market that couldn't be tracked by conventional means. Over the 2 years it was operational, my interest wasn't truly piqued, however, until the day it was shut down in 2013, and its owner, Ross William Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, was arrested. The criminal complaint also included correspondence between Ulbricht and a purported Hells Angels member the former had paid to kill a Silk Road user who tried to blackmail him. As the facts came out, this hit would prove to be the second of 6 Ulbricht is believed to have ordered, though it also emerged that each time, Dread Pirate Roberts had been duped, with all of the murders he'd paid for being faked. To me, this was when the Silk Road story went from being a special interest piece for drug and libertarian communities to a new frontier in organized crime. Not that everyone felt that way. As I alluded to, Ulbricht, as Dread Pirate Roberts, justified his criminal enterprise as a libertarian social experiment. From the very beginning, when a writer for Gawker asked the then anonymous Silk Road admin for a comment in an article that would be the first press coverage of the site, Ross couldn't help himself from urging readers to, I quote, "Stop funding the state with your tax dollars and direct your productive energies into the black market." His stretch goal, after not getting caught, was to single-handedly end the war on drugs by making buying illegal drugs so easy, enforcing current laws would be pointless. And he found an eager audience for his libertarian rhetoric in his customer base. And then, there were the fans of the other technology that made Silk Road possible. Bitcoin, the experimental digital currency that would be the template for the ecosystem of cryptocurrency, offered users a medium of exchange that gave them the possibility of anonymity. Though Bitcoin supporters tried to downplay the link, Silk Road was the first use case the world at large had for it, and advocate Roger Ver would latch himself to Ulbricht's cause by raising money for his defense, under the rationale, quote, "If guilty, he's a hero. If innocent, he needs help." Of course, the help Ulbricht received wasn't enough to match the evidence against him. Being arrested while logged on as Silk Road's administrator, and being unable to shut down and encrypt the laptop you used to run the site before it was seized, does that. Ulbricht was convicted of drug trafficking charges, among other things, in February 2015, a month before the release of Alex Winter's apologetic documentary Deep Web. He's currently doing life at USP Tucson. Over the years, I've followed the Silk Road story's fallout, hoping to find new revelations. So when I heard a book on the case was being published, I immediately put in an order. Nick Bilton's American Kingpin, the epic hunt for the criminal mastermind behind the Silk Road, was released in 2017, and today, it's still the only comprehensive book on the subject released since Ulbricht's conviction, which is unfortunate, as there's much room for improvement. American Kingpin can be loosely categorized as a non-fiction novel, focused on setting scenes with descriptive imagery, and the actions and interactions of his characters, rather than the overall history. In his Notes on Reporting, Bilton details the research he and an assistant made to reduce the speculation and creative liberty in his narrative nonfiction tale to a negligible amount. For someone who still believes in Ulbricht's innocence, this choice of writing style offers an easy excuse to write off the book, as Ulbricht's mother and principal spokesperson Lynn did, as a smear. Changing these people's minds, however, was not Bilton's goal. His description of Bitcoin as being anonymous, with no qualifications or disclaimers, makes it clear this is an entry-level book for people unfamiliar with the Silk Road story. I found that out the hard way. The other distinguishing feature of Bilton's writing style is his extremely short chapters. Roughly 4 pages on average. That's not a bad thing. In and of itself, it doesn't limit what information Bilton can give his readers, and it makes navigating the book easier. Bilton starts off in October of 2011, with DHS agent Jared Deryegian getting involved in the Silk Road case when he notices a trend of small covert drug deliveries in the mail, leading him to meet with the roommate of one of the site's customers. We then step back a few years to get to know our title character, Ross Ulbricht. Despite what Lynn Ulbricht's reaction to the book might suggest, American Kingpin is actually quite sympathetic to her son. Ross is described as a kind, gifted child. He's a pothead, but he's also ambitious and stung by the loss of opportunities that came with the Great Recession. In the beginning, we get to know Ulbricht through the eyes of his college girlfriend, Julia Vi, who witnesses both his self-imposed Spartan lifestyle and passion for libertarian politics. The latter is illustrated in a chapter where Ulbricht participates in a college debate to argue in favor of total legalization of drugs. When the book is on Ulbricht's POV, which is a substantial chunk, libertarianism is described in the most ideal terms regarding personal freedoms, but without much discussion of the larger repercussions of reducing the power of the government as his beloved Mises Institute would like. Bilton also puts off mentioning how the Ulbricht family owned multiple vacation homes in Costa Rica for rent and personal use until page 116 of 328. Ross's frugal ways are also somewhat less impressive with the knowledge that Ulbricht had a college scholarship to further dull any financial sting, which Bilton leaves out. Ross is described as broke and aimless prior to launching Silk Road, despite American Kingpin also acknowledging he'd effectively been left in charge of a used book business a friend brought him into after college. He'd also been able to buy a house to rent out while he got his master's degree at Penn State, and had $17,000 to spend to grow the psychedelic mushrooms that would be the first products on Silk Road. Bilton's agenda is clear enough. He has a character arc in mind for Ross Ulbricht, and he doesn't want to ruin it by making his readers see him as an out-of-touch rich kid from the get-go. The book keeps to a personal rather than historical focus by following Julia's disillusionment with Ross, who rebuffs her fears that his criminal enterprise is putting their future together in jeopardy, with his faith in technology to shield his identity, and pushes her indulgence of his politics to their limit by allowing the sale of guns on Silk Road. After they break up, Ulbricht finds a new confidant in a Silk Road user who warns him of a site security flaw he found. He was a globe-trotting Canadian pot seed dealer named Roger Thomas Clark. Ulbricht, and the world at large, would come to know him by the handle Variety Jones. Clark becomes an advisor and secret right-hand man to Ulbricht, a role that would come into focus during the latter's 2015 trial. Ulbricht treats Variety Jones as a startup company mentor, though Jones does offer more grounded advice for his enterprise, such as retaining a lawyer, a move Ulbricht rejects as defeatism. By this time, Ulbricht had already told a friend who'd helped him program Silk Road that he had relinquished control of the site, a lie he'd tell Julia later. But it was Variety Jones who suggested he expand this ruse into a greater myth. Jones came up with the idea of Silk Road's owner taking on the name Dread Pirate Roberts, taken from The Princess Bride, and pushing the idea that the current owner of Silk Road was someone besides its original creator. Variety Jones was also in a separate, simultaneous chat with Ulbricht when, in a move that would have made John Gotti cringe, Dread Pirate Roberts gave an interview to Forbes.com contributor Andy Greenberg, who took this charade at face value. Variety Jones, however, suggested the DPR alias with an ulterior motive, working his way into controlling the site. As he tells Ulbricht in one of their chats, while trying unsuccessfully to get an official partnership in Silk Road, I do well 2 ways, 50-50, or me having it all. Clark tells Ulbricht early on his weakness is that he's too trusting, or, in his words, your inability to discern between a garter snake and a copperhead. It's a useful metaphor thrown right into Bilton's lap, as he goes on to paint Clark himself as a dangerous snake. On the other side of the law, we have players from multiple law enforcement agencies who came together to take down Silk Road. Jared Deryegayan, an energetic, stubborn Chicago-based Homeland Security agent, sees Silk Road as an existential threat to his country. If no attempt is made to police the dark web, he says, soon enough, terrorists will begin to make use of it. Ulbricht's anti-government rhetoric, which at times veers into apocalyptic territory, does nothing to assuage these fears. Jared's own role in the takedown comes from him flipping an arrested Silk Road moderator, Cirrus, and going undercover on Silk Road after taking over her account. None of Ulbricht's employees knew his real identity, but with Cirrus's account, Jared made sure he was logged into Silk Road when his arrest went down. Chris Tarbell is your stereotypical FBI glory hound. By the time he shows up in the book, the DEA has already begun investigating Silk Road, but he's able to bring the Bureau into the race to catch DPR by claiming the site's sale of malware brought it into their jurisdiction. Tarbell tackles the problem from a cybersecurity perspective, exploiting a bug briefly introduced by a site update to find where Silk Road's servers were located, and acquiring a copy of the data within. It has a treasure trove of information, but it doesn't give them the identity of Dread Pirate Roberts. It's also a more complicated situation than Bilton lets on. In Ulbricht's pretrial hearings, when the FBI gave their explanation for how they located the server, outside observers said their explanation was incomplete. There was speculation that the real method wasn't a legal search, and if the matter was pressed, it might have gotten the server thrown out as evidence. We never did get a decisive answer to these allegations, and I'll explain why later. The actual identification of Ross Ulbricht as Dread Pirate Roberts was done by the DEA, or rather, a single IRS agent working with their Chelsea and New York strike force. Gary Alford, brought in to help with forensic accounting, ended up being the first to link Ulbricht to his creation through some simple Google searches, including digging up the first forum posts he made to promote the site. He's an unlikely hero, and the dramatic irony of him not seeing his find for what it is, in the face of seemingly greater exploits by other branches of law enforcement, serves Bilton's story well. And then, there was that other Homeland Security task force investigating Silk Road, the one in Baltimore, the one that employed DEA agent Carl Force and Secret Service agent Sean Bridges, who both found ways to corruptly cash in on the ongoing investigation. Their misdeeds went public when they were indicted shortly after Ulbricht's conviction. And while it didn't do the man himself any good, it was the best thing that could have happened to Ulbricht's public image. American Kingpin focuses on Carl Force by virtue of his role as an undercover operative on Silk Road. Posing as the Dominican drug trafficker Knob, who reaches out to DPR to do business, he raises red flags immediately by ignoring protocol while corresponding with the site's owner. Bilton also gives background on Force's troubled past and his financial problems, trying to draw some reader sympathy to him when he begins to sell information on his investigation to Ulbricht. The actions of Sean Bridges are presented without any such context. He is introduced, then, when he and Force take part in the arrest and flipping of moderator Curtis Chronic Pain Green, uses Green's account to steal Silk Road customer bitcoins. This theft would initially be pinned on the government's new cooperator, leading to that character arc for Ross Ulbricht I mentioned earlier. When Ulbricht starts Silk Road, Bilton doesn't try to challenge the idealism he wraps his motives in. When Julia is disturbed by Ross's positive reaction to seeing guns listed on Silk Road, readers can still assume that, being a libertarian from Texas, he simply has a blind spot to the potential repercussions of this. Chapter 39 sees Ulbricht asked to make a decision on Silk Road selling vital organs, allegedly not stolen, and cyanide. In both cases, Ulbricht falls back on the idea of a completely free market to approve, and then he learns that Chronic Pain was busted and apparently ripped off his clientele. Conveniently, the man he knows as Knob is in a position to track down Green, and at Ulbricht's behest, Force stages a photo shoot of Green being tortured to get the stolen coins back, a scene played with too much authenticity. Shortly afterwards, however, Variety Jones begins feeding into Ulbricht's concerns that letting Chronic Pain live, after pulling off a six-figure theft, would embolden other bad actors in his free market experiment. And so, Force receives a new request from DPR, and has Green stage a new photo shoot to fake his death. Himself emboldened, Ulbricht racked up his imagined body count to 6 before his arrest, paying the self-described Hells Angels biker Red and White to eliminate not just the user seeking to extort him, but an old scammer named Tony76 and 3 suspected accomplices. This time, Ulbricht doesn't hesitate because he's struggling with the idea of killing someone, but because he thinks Red and White is overcharging him for the service. With the presumed death of Curtis Green, Bilton tells us, Ulbricht has finally crossed the line. Chapter 44 contrasts Ulbricht having a good time on a camping trip with friends with one of the drug-related deaths that would come up during his sentencing hearing. At a school ball in Australia, a teenage student shares some hallucinogenic drugs he bought off Silk Road with 4 others, one of whom has a bad trip and jumps off a balcony. Bilton's intention is to show us the damage Ulbricht is inadvertently causing with his great experiment. The reality is worse than Bilton lets on. During the Forbes.com interview, when discussing the harms drugs can inflict regardless of the source, Greenberg asked point blank about the possibility of children being able to use Silk Road. Ulbricht would place all blame for children using drugs bought from his site on their parents, refusing to take any responsibility for his part in executing any such transactions. A line from Wired's 2-part history of Silk Road is even more blunt. At a time before his arrest, Green himself presented Ulbricht with a complaint of children being able to use his drug marketplace. I quote, "Perhaps that was a hair too much freedom," Green said. DPR erupted, "That's my whole idea!" Ulbricht wasn't unaware of such dangers. He simply didn't care. Until he was groveling at his sentencing hearing. Praise for American Kingpin is generally directed at its writing, rather than its history. And I do have to give it some points in that regard. There's a few more pieces of dramatic irony artfully included, as the FBI sees strange behavior from the Baltimore investigation that reflect the disarray Force and Bridges' corruption have caused. And even knowing how the story ends, I still felt some of the tension Bilton injected into Ulbricht's arrest. On the other hand, Bilton inexplicably let some details of the story slip away. For example, we get a throwaway mention of someone using the handle "Death from Above," threatening Ulbricht, but the author inexplicably doesn't mention this was a Carl Force scheme to blackmail DPR. In a Reddit AMA, Bilton mentioned that the DEA had almost seized a copy of the Silk Road servers themselves. A potentially groundbreaking find that goes unmentioned in American Kingpin. Other times, the lack of detail has a clear purpose: building tension where none should exist. A prime example is Bilton's handling of Red and White's fake hits. It's not until page 298, when discussing the pretrial motions, that he acknowledges no evidence of the alleged murders was found, and that Ulbricht was probably duped. This had actually been obvious from before Ulbricht's arrest, with the criminal complaint Tarbell wrote, noting proof only existed for a conspiracy and the payment to the purported hitman. Ulbricht himself probably figured it out when Red and White abruptly broke off correspondence after receiving a $500,000 loan from Silk Road. Red and White was ID'd in 2018 as Canadian ex-con James Ellingson, real criminal affiliation, not the Hells Angels, when he was picked up on unrelated charges. And the burden of proof is on anyone who wants to argue he wasn't also running the accounts of his supposed victims. Ulbricht's trial is compressed into a mere 4 pages, one of which is dedicated to the closing arguments. Bilton acknowledges the strength of the prosecution's evidence, but starts the very next chapter with Jared Deryekian unnerved after cross-examination by Ulbricht's lawyer Joshua Draytell, who supposedly made him look like a failure by bringing up the early suspects he'd investigated before Alford's discovery. It's a desperate attempt to raise uncertainty before the outcome of the trial is given on the next page. All charges found proven after 4 hours deliberation. American Kingpin simply does not do justice to the legal curb stomp Ross Ulbricht suffered at trial, one which was largely his own making. Though far from certain, Draytell's best shot at saving his client probably was in the pre-trial hearings, as he challenged the government's story on the server discovery. The best case scenario was that the evidence it contained could be excluded. Alternately, I imagine this could potentially have given him leverage to negotiate a better plea deal for his client than the government's opening offer of 10 to life. But that never happened, because presiding Judge Catherine Forrest ruled that, because Ulbricht never claimed ownership of the Silk Road server, by definition, his Fourth Amendment rights weren't potentially violated. As explained by Nicholas Weaver, one of the cybersecurity experts who questioned the official story, American law gives criminal defendants enough breathing room for Ulbricht to have claimed the server without technically incriminating himself, and Forrest made Ulbricht aware of this in time to act. The reason he failed to do so was he was now committed to turning the Dread Pirate Roberts legend into his official defense. In opening statements, Draytel caused a stir by admitting his client had created Silk Road, but claimed he handed it off early on, only for the new owners to give it back just in time for him to take the fall. What exactly this defense argument was supposed to accomplish is not entirely clear. I'm also confused as to why Ulbricht would pursue it, when the behavior of Variety Jones, who suggested it, should have made it clear it was never suggested for Ulbricht's benefit, but only to lay the groundwork for DPR's mentor to take control himself. And yet, Draytel continued with this, seizing on early speculation by Jared Deryegayan that disgraced Bitcoin exchange owner Mark Karpeles could be the real DPR, until Judge Forrest told him he couldn't just throw out accusations without proof. While the red and white correspondence was used as evidence against Ulbricht to support other charges, the only attempted murder he would ever be charged with was Curtis Green in a separate indictment. And even with the complication of Force and Bridges corruption, this charge wasn't dropped until the Supreme Court upheld the original trial's verdict in 2018, suggesting the only reason was judicial economy. The investigation into Force, and later Bridges, was still underway during the trial, and in preliminary hearings, Forrest agreed to have all mention of the Baltimore investigation kept off limits to avoid tipping him off. Draytel was not happy with this. Despite the case failing to produce any evidence, then or now, that could help Ulbricht's defense, and during the trial, he would try to bring it up regardless. In the face of the evidence the FBI scored from Ulbricht's laptop, including a diary he wrote out of conviction he was changing the world, Draytel put out the theory that the laptop had been hacked to plant proof of his client having long-term control of Silk Road. In lieu of any proof of this, he hoped he could at least achieve reasonable doubt by calling an expert witness who would explain how such a thing could happen. This witness was blocked from testifying, something that would be brought up in appeals and subsequent advocacy for Ross. A closer examination of what happened tells a different story. Draytel broke trial rules by not giving advance notice, and by not offering a proper explanation of what exactly this expert witness was going to say happened. In Weaver's eyes, Ulbricht's defense was based on such a faulty premise that trial by ambush, without the evidence and testimony seeing proper scrutiny, was his only hope. Forrest saw an even more cynical motive in the haphazard attempt to introduce his testimony. I quote, "Perhaps to try and accumulate appeal points," insinuating Draytel had lost all hope of winning an acquittal. Ulbricht's most recent appeal, rejected in June 2022, claimed ineffective counsel. Weaver's op-ed, written shortly before the guilty verdict he correctly anticipated, gave Draytel more credit, saying he played a poor hand as well as he could. Once Ulbricht is locked up, Bilton allows himself a mere 3 chapters to tell of the aftermath and dispose of the other characters. The first of these is dedicated to Variety Jones. Roger Thomas Clark was arrested in December 2015 in Thailand. Extradited to the US a year after American Kingpin was published, he pled out in 2020. Unfortunately, Bilton has very little information to give us on Ulbricht's right-hand man. There are more details to be gleaned from Eileen Ormsby's The Darkest Web, though perhaps still not enough to piece together a comprehensive profile. And given the uncertainty in Bilton's language in this chapter, I have to ask why he even bothered, especially when Julia, Carl Force, Sean Bridges, and the LEOs who actually did their jobs are all relegated to mere paragraphs. The last word goes to Jared der Yegan and his reaction to a seized package of 200 ecstasy pills found at Chicago O'Hare Airport. I understand what Bilton was going for. It bookends the story, which started with Jared seeking answers regarding one single pink pill of X, quite effectively, and it shows the new reality Ulbricht's work inspired. To me, personally, however, it lacks impact. My gold standard for a powerful nonfiction ending is currently Robert Lacey's Meyer Lansky biography, Little Man, and I think Bilton had an alternative that would take him closer to this. The penultimate chapter illustrates the undoing of Ulbricht's libertarian dreams of total freedom, with a brief description of prison life, but starts with the laptop he ran Silk Road from, the seizure of which doomed him at trial. At the time American Kingpin was published, it was an exhibit in the now-defunct Newseum in Washington, D.C. Ulbricht had partitioned it with logins for his personal life and Silk Road, and the former was never cracked. Move this chapter to the end. The sudden diversion to a hunk of hardware will seem less out of place if it's the book's conclusion, and in its current place, Bilton only uses the metaphor of the Ross login being locked away forever to parallel Ulbricht's current situation. I see potential for driving home the difference between the caring child Bilton's book started with and the murderous drug kingpin he ended on, and how the true nature of Ulbricht may remain elusive, even for someone like me, who has precious little sympathy for Ross. I still don't know to what extent he was deluded by ideology against simply being rotten. In conclusion, do I recommend American Kingpin? Only if you're completely unfamiliar with the case. For everyone else, here are some suggestions for further study. The aforementioned Darkest Web tells more tales of darknet markets in its first part, and I recommend it with 2 caveats. First, Eileen Ormsby is extremely sympathetic to Ulbricht and doesn't try to hide it. Second, the book lives up to its title and its content warnings. If you haven't seen Barely Sociable's Dream the Infiltration of the Darknet, make it the next video you watch after this. Barring the sort of absolute repeal of drug laws Ulbricht wanted, law enforcers will rise to the challenge of tracking down dealers on the deep web, and Barely's video illustrates just what a pipe dream DPR's vision of an untouchable online empire turned out to be. Finally, I refer you to a 2017 Deseret News profile of Aaron Shamo, a major darknet fentanyl dealer, which I'll be linking in the video description. It gives some insights into the user base of darknet markets, as opposed to the operators, but the subject also has some interesting parallels, as the writer notes, with the man who started it all.